The fishing vessel should have been visible. Its radio beacon was active. I could hear its engine through the fog, that low diesel thrum carrying over the black water in steady pulses that I felt in my ribs more than I heard with my ears. The harbor smelled wrong. Not storm wrong. Not fuel spill wrong. It smelled like exposed kelp, wet and green and ancient, the kind of odor that usually came hours before low tide. Not during a full incoming push with the water climbing the pilings by the minute. I had the binoculars braced against the wheelhouse window. My ears kept popping, small hard-pressure snaps, like I was driving down a mountain road instead of standing at sea level in a harbor I'd spent the last week learning by heart. The beacon marked the vessel just outside the channel mouth. The sound of the engine came from somewhere to my left. But all I could see through the gray was open water, unbroken, empty, moving with the slow, oily lift of the tide. Then the radio cracked. Harbor master, requesting docking clearance. The voice was calm, local, a little breathless, like the speaker had been working a deck line. I glanced at the screen again. Same call sign, same transponder, same vessel. State your position, I said. Pause. Static hissed. Somewhere in the fog, a bell buoy rang once. Then the voice came back. We're already inside the harbor. I looked up so fast the binoculars hit the bridge of my nose. There was still nothing out there. Just fog. Just tide. Just the smell of kelp where no kelp should have been. And the thing I couldn't stop thinking about was this. If the water looked normal, why did the local rules get stricter on days like this? That was 11 days into the job. I took the position because on paper it looked like the cleanest professional step I could make without leaving the coast. I had spent most of my career moving between marinas, municipal docks, and one ugly stretch of commercial waterfront farther south where the ice heave cracked steel bollards every winter, and half my job involved settling arguments between lobstermen and tour captains. Harbor work suited me because it rewarded the kind of mind I had. I liked charts that matched shorelines. I liked written procedure. I liked knowing that if a light failed on a breakwater or a vessel missed a check-in, there was a chain of action that led from uncertainty back to control. The posting in Hancock County came up after the previous harbor master retired with almost no notice. That was the phrase they used, retired with almost no notice, which sounded more like an apology than a fact. Small fishing community near Frenchman Bay. Year-round vessel traffic. Seasonal tourism. Federal coordination required. Housing included. Good salary. Better than good, really, once you priced what it cost to live that far up the coast. I arrived in early spring when the mornings still carried a wet cold that got into your cuffs and stayed there. The harbor sat inside a rough cradle of ledge and working piers. Not picturesque unless you knew what to look at. Everything smelled of salt, rust, old rope, and diesel. The gulls were mean. The water was darker than I was used to, a kind of iron blue that turned black under clouds. Nolan Pierce Greeley met me on my first morning because part of the job involved regular coordination with the Coast Guard station. Nolan had the polished kind of confidence that comes from trusting his training more than any place he hasn't lived in for long. He was younger than I expected for a liaison, clean shave, neat jacket, clipboard dry even in the mist, and he moved through orientation like he was reading from a manual he'd already approved. He walked me through emergency frequencies, reporting standards, vessel tracking obligations, and federal compliance. He spoke precisely with that flat official rhythm people get when they've repeated the same rules often enough to stop hearing how odd they sound aloud. During king tides, he said, tapping the printed regulations, permit all vessels to enter harbor. More depth means safer passage. Maintain navigation lights throughout every incoming tide. Investigate all distress calls immediately. Record every vessel observed on radar. Full record-keeping matters here because weather closes in fast. That all tracked. It was conservative. It was a little rigid for a small harbor, maybe, but not unreasonable. What struck me was what the local calendar on the wall showed. The stricter notations weren't marked under storms. They weren't marked under gale advisories. Several ordinary-looking tide days had red circles around them, with penciled notes in cramped handwriting I couldn't yet read. Midnight closure. West Cove watch. No fuel transfer after moonrise. The ink had been rubbed by fingers so often the paper felt soft. Nolan saw me looking. "Local habits," he said. "You'll find some of them superstitious. Best thing you can do is standardize." He said it lightly, like he was helping me clear clutter. Kira Lynn Babcock came in 10 minutes after Nolan left. I heard her boots first, firm on the warped office floorboards, then the scrape of a cardboard archive box against the door frame. She was the deputy harbor master, though that title didn't really capture the way the harbor seemed to lean toward her even when she wasn't speaking. She had the weathered stillness of someone who knew where every cleat, ladder, and sandbar had been before I ever saw the place. Her jacket smelled faintly of cold salt and fish scales. There was a nick in one knuckle that had gone white with age. She didn't waste words. "These were on the old man's desk," she said. She set the box in front of me. Inside were harbor logs going back decades, bound in cracked covers, a stack of tied tables, and a bundle of loose pages wrapped in an elastic band gone brittle with time. Several entries had been marked with slips of blue paper. On top of the pile sat a sealed packet with my full name on it. Not harbor master. Not new appointee. Thaddeus Owen Merrill. The handwriting on the front was neat, deliberate, and old enough that the ink had browned. I looked up at her. "What is this?" Kira shrugged once. "Read the marked pages first." Then she left me alone with the smell of damp paper and mildew and old salt. The marked pages weren't folklore. That was what unsettled me first. If they'd been ghost stories or muttered warnings about bad luck, I could have put them where people like me always put local superstitions, into the category of useful culture and operational noise. But the notes read like field corrections. Close the harbor during king tides. Extinguish navigation lights after midnight. Ignore distress calls originating beyond Gull Point. Never record vessels that appear twice. Not one of those instructions matched the federal sheet Nolan had walked me through. I checked dates. The hidden rules were scattered through logs over years, sometimes buried in margins, sometimes copied whole onto loose pages, sometimes written like a reminder to the next person. At the time, I assumed I was looking at the residue of some long-standing conflict between local practice and outside oversight. That seemed human. That seemed manageable. I know now that was the last ordinary explanation I had. Near the bottom of the box, under the marked logs, sat 5 sealed case files tied with cotton string. Each one had my name on it. Not all in the same hand. Not all in the same ink. I didn't open them that day. I wish I had. Instead, I spent my first week doing what competent people do when they inherit a messy system. I learned channel depths, slip assignments, fuel schedules, tidal sets, winter damage reports, and which boats ran late as a habit versus which ones ran late because something was wrong. I checked lights, tested radios, updated the radar console, and walked the docks until I could have crossed them blindfolded from sound alone. And all the while, something small kept rubbing at the back of my mind. On days when the tide book looked harmless, Kira got quieter. And twice, standing near the west side of the harbor mouth, I felt my ears pop as if I had stepped through a change in altitude no chart could mark. The first duplicate contact came in on an afternoon tide so ordinary I remember thinking the day might finally let me settle. There was a soft rain. Not enough to matter. The pilings sweated black water. Somewhere beyond the sheds a generator coughed in a steady offbeat rhythm. The office smelled of wet wool, coffee that had been sitting too long, and that same green kelp stink that had no business arriving before the water had even turned. Radar painted a local fishing vessel on approach. I knew the vessel by silhouette by then, a workboat with a high bow and a lazy roll. I watched it come in through the outer channel, take the expected swing around the markers, and dock exactly where it always docked. I saw the hull with my own eyes. I heard lines toss. I signed off the berth assignment. End of matter. 20 minutes later, the radar console painted the same contact again. Same transponder. Same route. Same speed. The track ran over the first one so perfectly it looked copied and laid over itself. If I hadn't been watching the screen, I would have assumed the system had frozen and repeated the previous pass. I checked the harbor. The vessel was already tied up. I could see its mast through the office window, slick with rain. I checked the timestamp. Current. I checked the signal strength. Strong. Then the transponder pinged again from outside the channel mouth. I called the vessel on radio. The man who answered was on deck at his slip, irritated that I was bothering him about a boat he'd already secured. While I was still listening to him, the second contact moved deeper into the channel. Every official instinct I had told me to log exactly what I was observing. Record every vessel observed on radar. That was the rule. Systems fail. Identities get spoofed. Equipment malfunctions. If there are two signals, you document two signals. My hand was already on the keyboard when I heard someone move behind me. Kira had come in so quietly I hadn't noticed. Rain hissed against the window glass. She looked at the screen once, then at my hand. Don't. There wasn't fear in her voice. There was impatience, like I'd nearly put the wrong tool into the wrong machine. It's on radar, I said. I have to log it. No, you don't. It's a contact in the channel. It's not a contact, she said. It's a repeat. That wasn't an explanation. I turned toward her. Those are the same thing to the Coast Guard. Then the Coast Guard can keep being wrong somewhere off their own docks. She reached past me, opened the provisional record window, and deleted the draft before it hit the archive queue. She did it calmly. No hesitation. No look at the door. No concern that I might stop her or report her. Her fingers smelled faintly of bait and cold iron when they brushed the desk. You can't just erase a vessel track. Kira kept her eyes on the radar. I can if there was never a second vessel. The contact kept moving. We both watched the mark travel the inner channel that I could see clearly from the window. Open water. Gray rain. Empty lane between the buoys. Nothing passed. Then the signal stopped exactly at the same slip where the real boat was already tied. I felt a pressure snap inside my left ear hard enough to make me wince. Kira finally looked at me. If you start making permanent records of things that only exist on certain tides, people with uniforms come in asking why we ignored procedure. Then they go looking for proof. Then they put more boats in the water. She turned back to the screen and cleared the transient contact from the live display. That's when people get hurt. Later that evening, with the rain blown out and the harbor darkening towards slate, I stepped outside to walk the piers. The first vessel sat where it belonged, rope creaking, hull knocking softly against rubber fenders. The smell of diesel had faded. I could hear gulls farther inland where they should have been settling for the night. Halfway down the finger pier, I looked out toward the harbor mouth and saw another set of mast lights sliding in over the chop. Same height, same shape, same boat. I stood very still. The cold damp soaked through my collar. My tongue tasted metal. The second vessel crossed behind a fog seam near the mooring field and did not come out the other side. At the time I told myself there had to be a geometry to it, a reflection, an atmospheric layer, a timing fault between what I saw and what the radar had painted. What mattered more was this. Kira had not reacted like a person seeing something impossible. She had reacted like a person seeing something routine. Gull Point sat east of the harbor like a broken tooth of dark rock. On a chart it was nothing dramatic, just a headland with bad ledge beneath it and enough confused water around the turn to make small craft behave carefully. In person it always felt farther away than it looked. The cliff faced their trap sound. On some mornings the surf came back off it with a long low note that reminded me of whales, except sonar would show nothing larger than bait balls and the occasional seal line. The first distress call came just after sunset on a clear evening with a slow swell and no active weather. The voice on the radio was male, breathless, controlled the way people get when they are trying very hard not to sound afraid. Mayday, mayday, vessel disabled beyond Gull Point. Taking drift. Request immediate assistance. He gave coordinates. They were valid. Not vague. Not panicked. He gave them with the crispness of someone trained enough to know bad radio gets people killed. I reached for the response sheet. Kira, who had been in the back office sorting fuel receipts, said from behind me, "Don't answer that." I turned. "It's a distress call. Beyond Gull Point. That doesn't matter. It matters here." There it was again. The split between the printed world and the place itself. I answered anyway because of course I did. I requested vessel identification, damage details, persons aboard. The reply came after a static wash that made the speakers fuzz. Engine flooded. Fog moving in hard. Hail by morning. I remember that last line because the sky outside the window was clear enough to show a red cut of sunset under the clouds. The barometer was steady. There was no hail forecast until the following afternoon. I repeated the weather discrepancy to Nolan Pierce Greeley when I contacted him, expecting maybe a shrug, maybe a comment about stress or confusion. Instead, Nolan locked onto the one thing in the call that fit his training. "Coordinates are clean," he said. "You dispatch." No vessel was found. The search team ran the coordinates, then expanded, then checked again at first light. Open water. Nothing adrift. No debris. No slick. No flare residue. No body. Nothing. 3 nights later, the same wording came over the radio in a woman's voice. "Mayday, mayday, vessel disabled beyond Gull Point. Taking drift. Request immediate assistance." Same pause before the damage report. Same mention of fog moving in hard. Same hail by morning. I started pulling older incident records after that. At first I was looking for proof of prank traffic, false alarms, a local habit of testing new harbor masters by making them chase shadows off a headland. Instead, I found pages of failed responses going back years. Different operators had transcribed the calls in varying shorthand, but the message didn't vary. Not in substance. Sometimes the speaker sounded young, sometimes old, sometimes male, sometimes female, once even hoarse enough that the recorder marked the transmission as possibly mechanical. The coordinates shifted within a narrow band beyond Gull Point. Search outcomes stayed the same. Nothing found. One archived note from more than 30 years earlier had been underlined hard enough to dent the paper. Voices change. Wording doesn't. Do not follow. Another page included the time of the call and the next day's weather report clipped to the margin. Same pattern. The distress transmission described conditions that had not yet happened. I started listening to old recordings in the office after dark because I couldn't stand the idea of reading only summaries. If there was a pattern, I wanted to hear it myself. The room would go cold after midnight, even with the baseboard heater clicking. Salt damp crept out of the walls. More than once, while a decades-old voice crackled from the speaker asking for help in the same exact phrasing as the newest call, I heard something underneath the transmission. Not speech. Not engine. A long-distance sound, low and hollow, like a whale call stretched through a pipe. I checked historical sonar logs from search runs. Nothing substantial had ever been detected in those windows. No large marine life concentrations. No obstruction moving through the search zone. Yet the sound kept showing up in the audio, faint but present, almost under the human voice. I brought that to Nolan. He dismissed it in 2 sentences. Marine noise carries strangely around rock. False audio associations happen when you're listening for patterns. That was the first time I realized Nolan Pierce Greeley was not investigating the same problem I was. He believed the danger came from human error and local myth. I was starting to suspect the human error was assuming those 2 things were separate. The call that broke me away from any ordinary explanation came at 1:30 in the morning. The harbor was black except for the navigation lights and the sodium glow over the fuel shed. My coffee had gone bitter. The tide was coming in. I could smell exposed kelp anyway, rich and rotten and green, a low-tide smell climbing into the office hours too early. My ears had been popping on and off all night. The radio hissed alive. Same mayday. Same coordinates beyond Gull Point. Same request for immediate assistance. Then the voice added, in a dry whisper that still makes my neck go cold when I remember it. "Tell Nolan Pierce Greeley the marker buoy is already gone." I checked the window. The buoy light was still there, swinging in the dark. At dawn, the gale line arrived early. By noon, the buoy had broken loose exactly as the voice had said. That detail seemed minor then. A lucky guess. Maybe a fisherman had seen where on the mooring chain. I have thought about it every day since. The first king tide under my watch came with sunshine. That was part of what made my decision feel so reasonable at the time. If the weather had been ugly, if the sea had already been throwing spray over the outer rocks or shoving cross chop into the channel, I might have leaned harder on local caution. But the sky came up thin blue and bright. The air was sharp with cold salt and gull feathers. Out in the bay the water looked almost polished, rising higher by the hour with a deceptive smoothness that made the whole coast seem quieter than usual. Nolan Pierce Greeley arrived before noon with updated federal guidance and the kind of brisk certainty that had started to grate on me without my wanting to admit it. "This is exactly when small harbors make mistakes," he said, setting his folder on my desk. "People overcorrect for folklore and lock traffic out when deeper water gives you your best safety margin." He didn't say folklore to insult anybody. He said it like a diagnosis. Kira Lynn Babcock was on the far side of the room checking line assignments. She didn't even look up. "The printed tables don't know this harbor," she said. Nolan gave a short smile that did not reach his eyes. "Tide tables know every harbor." I should have heard the warning in the silence that followed. Instead, I took the professional middle ground. I enforced the official procedures. Harbor open during king tide. Navigation lights kept active through the full incoming cycle. Any distress traffic answered at once. Any contact on radar recorded. On paper, it was exactly the safe decision. By late afternoon, the water had climbed so high the lower cross braces beneath the docks vanished under green-black swell. The pilings groaned. The whole harbor smelled scrubbed raw, salt and weed and wet wood. Every so often that deeper wail-like sound rolled in from outside the mouth, low enough to feel in the soles of my feet. Shortly after dusk, the first distress call came from beyond Gull Point. Then a second one, overlapping the first by less than a minute. Different voices. Same words. Nolan told me to dispatch. Kira said, "No." I hesitated for half a breath too long, and that was enough for Nolan to grab the microphone himself and begin coordinating a response. One of the local workboats had already volunteered. A second vessel moved to support. Their running lights slid out across the darkening channel, red and green points rocking in the tide. At first the comms were normal. Position updates. Speed. Visibility. Then the first captain came back on, voice tight. "Harbor Master." My GPS just walked 50 yards sideways. The second vessel reported compass drift less than a minute later. Then both boats lost their radar picture within seconds of each other. I stepped outside. The air hit me cold and wet, carrying the heavy stink of kelp so strong it coated the back of my throat. There was no fog yet. Just a thin glaze of mist over the water and the hard white shine of our own navigation lights reflecting too long across the channel, stretched farther than reflection should have allowed. One of the outgoing boats suddenly appeared wrong to me. Not damaged, not sinking, wrong in position. It seemed both farther off and too close, as though the water between us had folded and the light from its mast was reaching me by a path the hull itself wasn't taking. Then the radio burst into layered noise. One captain shouted that the ledge was directly ahead. The other swore he was in open water. They were less than 100 yards apart and describing different coastlines. Kira was already moving before I understood that. She strode to the light board mounted in the office and began killing sections of harbor illumination in a sequence that made no sense to me. Outer markers first. Then the east dock floodlamps. Then the high mast near the fuel shed. Each switch snapped down with a hard plastic click. "What are you doing?" "Making the shoreline smaller." "That's insane." "No," she said, without even turning. "This is late." Nolan lunged for the board. Kira blocked him with one arm and he actually bounced back off her. That stunned him more than it should have. I think he still believed this was an argument about authority, about procedure, about whose name belonged on the report after. Outside, one of the boats revved hard. I heard the engine strain, then drop. A horn blared 3 fast notes from somewhere that could have been just beyond the pier or half a mile out. Kira shoved a handheld spotlight into my chest. "Do not sweep it on the water. Point it at the dock planks only. Give them a line to follow." I did it because in that moment she was the only person acting like she recognized the shape of the emergency. The beam shook across wet boards, bright enough to silver every nail head. Water slapped beneath the floats. My ears popped so hard I nearly staggered. The long wail-like note came again, closer now, rising under the clatter of rigging. Then one of the workboats emerged from the dark at an angle that should have put it into rock. Instead it slid between the piers by feet. Captain White faced at the wheel, both electronics dead. The second boat came in seconds later with a gash down the rub rail where it had kissed ledge but not grounded. No one died. That was the narrow mercy of the night. When the tide turned and the pressure in the air finally eased, Nolan Pierce Greeley was furious in the bright, clipped way of a man who had almost watched his own rules fail in public. "You obstructed navigation," he told Kira. "You interfered with a federal response." Kira stared at him until he stopped sounding certain. "What you call navigation," she said, "only works when the water is behaving." After he left, after the captains were ashore and shaking and trying not to say how lost they had felt in water they knew by blood, Kira handed me one of the old logs from the box she had brought my first day. The page was warped with age and smelled faintly of mildew and salt. Written across the top in careful block letters were the words I had already seen in fragments. "Close the harbor during king tides. Extinguish navigation lights after midnight. Ignore distress calls originating beyond Gull Point. Never record vessels that appear twice." "We didn't invent those," she said. "We inherited them." "From who?" "From everybody who lived long enough to write them down." That was the night I understood something had been hidden from me on purpose. Not by Kira. Not even by Nolan, not exactly. By the whole structure above the harbor. Official procedure assumed the ocean here behaved like water and weather and rock. The local logs assumed something else shared the coastline and sometimes overruled all three. The betrayal wasn't personal. It was procedural. And that made it worse. Once I accepted that the local records might be evidence instead of superstition, I stopped reading them as stories and started reading them as a case file. Harbor logs led to fuel records. Fuel records led to incident summaries. Incident summaries led to county archives, survey maps, weather notebooks, old newspaper clippings, and the locked cabinet in the back office that held everything nobody had managed to classify cleanly. I spent days breathing dust, cold paper, and that persistent salt damp that somehow reached even files stored inland from the docks. My fingers grew cracked from turning brittle pages. More than once I came up from a stack of records and realized my ears were popping again, though I was nowhere near the water. The pattern was older than the harbor authority itself. Colonial-era letters from settlers along the outer coves described nights when lanterns on the shore were seen in the wrong order from the bay. A surveyor's journal from the 1800s mentioned that a particular inlet seemed longer when approached by boat than when measured on foot the next morning. A lobsterman's widow, quoted in a yellowing local paper from the 1920s, said her husband once rowed past a cove mouth that opened wider and wider until he turned around and found the entrance no larger than a split in rock. That one stayed with me. Entire coves occasionally appeared larger from the sea than from land. Not metaphorically. Not as if people were mistaken about distance. Larger, broader, deepened, reorganized. The descriptions always clustered around certain tidal conditions. Not storms. Not lunar phases in the vague folk sense. Precise rises. Specific intervals between high water and midnight. Days the printed tide chart treated as normal enough to go unnoticed by anybody outside the harbor. I spread decades of notes across the office floor one night, opening the windows despite the cold because the room smelled strongly of kelp though the tide was near full. My flashlight threw hard white bars over paper. The old wood beneath my knees felt damp. I was trying to build a correlation matrix by hand because the surviving records were too irregular for anything simpler. That was when I opened the first sealed case file with my name on it. The paper inside was older than I was. Older by decades. The outer envelope had been addressed to Thaddeus Owen Merrill in ink brown with age. Inside was a single folded tide chart, a photocopy of a harbor log page from the 1960s, and a note in another hand. If this reached Thaddeus Owen Merrill, check the West Cove on the first fog after the early spring king tide. If the seals leave before dark, do not trust the channel markers. I sat there with the paper in my hand and listened to the window glass tick in the cold. At first I thought it had to be some family connection, some older relative with the same name. But my middle name was there too. the spelling exact. No Merrill line in my family had lived in Hancock County. I checked that before taking the job because my mother kept genealogies the way other people kept recipe cards. I tore through the remaining sealed files. Different years, different paper, different hands. My name on every front. One file contained only a copy chart with 3 coves circled in red. One held a page from a logbook margin where someone had written, "For Thaddeus Owen Merrill, if you can smell kelp before the ebb, stay off the ledge by Gull Point." Another had no note at all, just a page listing dates when navigation lights had been deliberately disabled despite official order. No explanation, no sender, no origin for how those names had been chosen or copied forward. I checked the oldest log in the office, then the county copies, then the scanned preservation files. Near the spine of a harbor ledger dated decades before I was born, on a page mostly devoted to fuel tallies and storm damage, my full name had been written lightly in pencil in the margin beside a note about an unexplained fog bank. Thaddeus Owen Merrill to review. The graphite had sunk so deep into the fiber that erasing it would have torn the paper. At the time, I still tried to frame it rationally. A prank reproduced over years. A clerical coincidence. Somebody backdating a note to rattle the newcomer. I know better now. People can fake paper. They can fake ink. They can fake dates if they're patient. What they can't fake is the way a record settles into every copy and cross-reference around it, as if it had always belonged there. I took the files to Kira Lynn Babcock the next morning. The office was cold. The harbor smelled normal for once, just fish slime and diesel and wet rope. Kira read the top envelope, then the note inside, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw her lose expression entirely. "Have you seen this before?" I asked. She took a while to answer. "I've seen your name," she said. "Never knew why. You're saying this was already in the logs before I got here." "Long before." "Who put it there?" She shook her head once. "That's the wrong question." I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because by then I had started to understand that every answer in that harbor came with a trapdoor under it. "What's the right one?" Kira handed the papers back. How did they know to keep copying it? That was the point where my investigation changed shape. I was no longer asking whether the records were false. I was asking what kind of coastline could teach generations of practical people to preserve a warning for a man who had not been born yet. I didn't understand what I was looking at yet, but I was starting to understand that the harbor had not hired me into an office. It had inherited me into a sequence. The fog bank arrived on a morning so still the harbor seemed to be holding its breath. No wind, no rain, no swell worth naming. The tide tables marked the day as unremarkable except for a neat little interval that matched 2 of the older red circles on the calendar. I would have missed it if I hadn't been cross-checking everything now against the notes in the sealed files. I smelled the kelp before dawn. Not faintly. Strong enough that when I stepped outside the housing behind the office I actually looked toward the flats, expecting half the bay to have drained away. But the water was high and dark and motionless except for a slow-sucking lift around the pilings. The odor sat over everything. Wet green weed, iodine, old stone. The underside of the coast dragged into the air too soon. When I reached the harbor, Kira Lynn Babcock was already on the west side with binoculars. She didn't greet me. She just pointed. The harbor seals that usually loafed on a low shoal off the cove had abandoned it entirely. A whole slick line of them was moving inland across the exposed stones by the service ramp. Their bodies awkward and fast, snouts lifted, not panicked exactly but decided. One after another, they left the water and kept going. "Do they always do that?" I asked. "Only when it's about to come close." The fog itself did not roll in from the bay the way weather fog does. Thickened in place. 1 minute the harbor mouth was clear enough to show the channel markers. The next, gray opacity had gathered in the water between them, as if the air were condensing upward out of the tide. My ears popped twice, then a third time hard enough to make my jaw ache. Nolan Pierce Greeley arrived in a truck with a portable weather station and the expression of a man prepared to disprove something local. He set instruments, checked humidity, checked pressure, checked visibility. All the readings told him he should have been right. "Advection layer," he said. Cold water meeting warm air. Kira didn't bother replying. I raised the binoculars and looked into the thickening gray. At first I thought I was seeing reflections. Massed lines. Dock shadows. The harbor copying itself in the fog the way streetlights double in wet glass at night. Then the geometry settled and I realized the shapes out there did not match what was behind me. There was another harbor in the fog. Not a vision of ours. Not a mirror. Another arrangement entirely. Docks stood where open water should have been. A long pier ran from a cliff face that in reality had no structure on it. Buildings occupied impossible ground, some low and weather black, some with rooflines I knew this town did not have. The channel bent wider than the real one, then split. Vessels sat in slips that did not exist, several of them shaped exactly like modern fishing boats, down to enclosed wheelhouses and mast rigs, but marked by no numbers I recognized. One hull moved without wake through water that looked smoother than the sea around it, almost glassed over. The most disturbing part wasn't that it was impossible. It was that it behaved with the quiet regularity of infrastructure, as if that harbor had its own traffic, its own routes, its own right to exist. I lowered the binoculars, pulse hammering in my throat. "It's there," I said, before I could stop myself. Nolan glanced at me, then into the fog with naked eyes. "What is?" Kira kept watching through her lenses. "Don't say too much while it's close," she said softly. That should have sounded insane. Instead it landed with the same ugly weight as every local rule I had already watched prove itself. I looked again. One of the vessels in the fog slid past the end of the impossible pier, and I saw its profile clearly enough to recognize it. It was the same fishing boat that had appeared twice on radar. Not similar. The same. Except this version carried a rust streak down the starboard side that the real one did not have. My fingers tightened so hard around the binocular barrel they hurt. The fog shifted. For a moment I saw the coastline behind the other harbor and my stomach dropped. Gull Point was there, but not as a headland. It opened into a broad black throat of water cutting farther inland than any chart allowed, lined with rock walls slick as exposed muscle under rain. Then the image trembled and thinned. The impossible docks faded first. The false vessels next. The widened channel last of all, narrowing back into the bay I knew. When I lowered the binoculars again, Nolan Pierce Greeley was staring at me with something like concern. "You're white as paper," he said. "What did you think you saw?" "Thought." That was the word he used. I could still smell the kelp. I could still hear the low distant whale sound rolling under the fog, though the portable sonar unit mounted on the dock showed empty water and static. The seals were still inland, huddled on stone above the tide line. Kira finally looked at me. "Now you know why the rules tighten on calm days," she said. "Storms don't matter. Alignment does." That was the first time anyone gave the thing a category. Not a name. Not a species. Condition. Alignment. The rest of that day I kept catching brief mistakes at the edge of my sight. A piling standing 1 foot to the left of where it should have been. A mooring buoy seeming nearer until I blinked. Once, while checking the outer floats, I looked down and saw the water beneath me slant inward as if draining into a channel that wasn't there. Then it flattened again. By dusk the fog was gone and the real harbor remained. But I knew then that real was no longer a stable word. Kira Lynn Babcock finally told me the truth because by then I was contaminated enough to be useful. That was her word. Not infected. Not cursed. Not chosen. Contaminated. We sat in the office after dark with the windows shut tight against the cold. The room smelled of old coffee, wet canvas, and the briny mineral scent that always seemed to rise from the harbor logs once the tide turned. Kira had spread 3 generations of notebooks across my desk, some official, some not, some so water-warped they barely closed. Outside, halyards tapped faintly against masts in an uneven rhythm. "Our people figured it out by surviving it," she said. She spoke without drama. That made it harder to resist. The harbor workers, not the town council, not the Coast Guard, not anybody outside the docks. Men and women who stayed long enough started noticing the same things. Days when the coast didn't hold still. Nights when lights brought the wrong traffic. Calls that led nowhere except more boats. They changed how they worked because the water punished the old way. I asked why the official regulations were the opposite of the hidden ones. Because official procedure assumes more information makes you safer, she said. More lights, more records, more rescue traffic, more witnesses. That's true most places. Here, on certain tides, every one of those things gives it more to work with. She nodded toward the window, toward the harbor, toward all the black water beyond. The thing under the coast. She explained the rules one by one, not like superstition, but like lessons written in scar tissue. Close the harbor during king tides because more depth doesn't just help vessels. It opens routes beneath them. Extinguish navigation lights after midnight because moving light on the water gives false shoreline to anything trying to orient through the channel. Ignore distress calls originating beyond Gull Point because those calls do not come from people who can still be reached. Never record vessels that appear twice because the second contact is not a vessel in the legal sense. It is a recurrence, and every official response to a recurrence sends more traffic into the overlap. I asked her what overlap meant. She took a long time answering. Not because she didn't know, I think, but because some knowledge in that harbor only grew teeth when spoken plainly. Sometimes, she said, when it moves near the upper chambers, the coast stops agreeing with itself. Water, rock, signals, distance. They all start borrowing from the wrong version. I remembered the other harbor in the fog. The widened cove at Gull Point. The duplicate workboat with the rust streak it did not have in reality. Then what are the distress calls? Her jaw tightened. Things it heard. Things it keeps. There are sentences that change a profession into something else. That was one of them. I had been trying to investigate maritime anomalies. Kira was describing territorial behavior. She told me the unofficial procedures predated every modern authority over the harbor. Town workers passed them down. Harbor masters learned them or got someone killed. When federal reporting standards hardened after the middle of the last century, local practice had to split in two. One set of rules for the paperwork. Another for surviving the tides that mattered. Why didn't anyone just say this out loud? I asked. Why hire me into this blind? Kira looked genuinely tired then. Tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. Because if you tell an outsider on day one that the coastline opens wrong on certain tides and a thing under the bay repeats distress traffic, he reports you, leaves, or thinks you're broken. We needed to know which kind you were. You could have let me get people killed in the process. Her eyes met mine. Gray, steady, impossible to read. We nearly did. That was the nearest she came to apology. I asked about my name in the older files. The sealed envelopes. The notes decades before my birth. Kira rubbed at the nick across her knuckle. The oldest time I ever saw your name in the record, it was already being copied from something older. Every harbor master after that kept it in. Some added notes for you. None of them wrote the first one. How did they know I'd be here? She looked toward the window again, where black water reflected no light because we'd switched most of it off after midnight. I don't know if they knew you'd be here. I only know they believed the record wanted you. That was worse than any answer she could have given. She also told me something I had already begun to suspect. Once you spend enough time around the wrong tides, you notice more than other people. The smell of kelp comes early because you learn to detect the exposed caves below the waterline before the tide reaches them. The pressure change in the ears happens where cavities under the rock begin pulling and releasing air through cracks too deep to chart. The whale-like sound is not a whale. It is the harbor hearing the thing move. Can it make you see things that aren't there? I asked. Kira shook her head. It makes you see things that usually don't line up with where you are. That line sat in me like a stone. Then she gave me the old journals in full and said if I wanted proof I could still touch with my hands. I needed to stop reading only the margins and start tracing the maps hidden underneath them. Every harbor master leaves notes in the same places, she said. Not on the page. In the page. Read the indentations. Hold them to side light. Follow the coves that keep getting crossed out and redrawn. She stood to leave, then paused with her hand on the door. One more thing. If Nolan Pierce really pushes for a full federal survey before the next king tide, stop him. Why? Because if outsiders come in with bright lights, active sonar, and rescue doctrine, they won't be investigating it. She opened the door. Cold salt air slid in around her. They'll be feeding it. By then I believed enough to test. I took the journals Kira Lynn Babcock had given me and spent 2 straight nights under angled lamplight reading not the ink but the pressure the ink had left on pages beneath. Harbor masters had indeed hidden maps inside maps. A line pressed too hard on one page became a cove mouth on the next. Repeated hatch marks aligned into channels no official survey showed. Whole sections of coastline had been traced, crossed out, and traced again with subtle variations, as if the men and women keeping those logs had been trying to document a shoreline that would not consent to a single shape. When I overlaid the indentations onto modern bathymetry, the pattern emerged. A network of submerged caverns ran beneath the rocky coast from Gull Point past the West Coves and under a section of ledge most charts treated as solid shelf. Not little sea caves, not wave hollows chambers. Connected voids large enough to move something through. I needed sonar to test it. Nolan Pierce Greeley gave me access, though not for the reason I told him. By then Nolan believed he was helping me build a proper case against local tampering. He thought Kira had contaminated the record, corrupted reporting, and frightened me with folklore until I started seeing patterns in noise. He wasn't entirely wrong about the contamination. He was catastrophically wrong about the source. We took the survey launch out under a pale overcast that flattened the bay into dull pewter. The air tasted of rain but held none. My ears had started popping before we even cleared the inner markers. Nolan noticed and suggested sinus pressure from stress. I didn't answer. The portable sonar array hummed to life beneath us. Its pulse came up through the deck in a faint regular vibration. Gulls wheeled over the stern, then abruptly veered inland before we reached Gull Point. I marked that too. At first the bottom profile looked normal enough. Ledge shelves, drop-offs, broken stone. Then the caverns began. One void opened under the display wider than the harbor itself. Then another. Then a corridor between them, narrowing and broadening in smooth curves that no collapse or erosion pattern I knew would have produced. We ran the transect twice because Nolan assumed the first pass had glitched. It hadn't. By the third pass even he had gone quiet. The chambers continued inland under rock that should have been dense. Some rose close enough to the surface that only a skin of stone separated open air from open water. Others plunged deeper and then connected by sloping throats toward the bay. The whole thing resembled less a cave system than a circulatory route. I felt cold all through my back despite the jacket. Nolan leaned over the monitor. This wasn't on any previous survey. It was never surveyed during the right tide windows, I said. He glanced at me, disturbed by how certain I sounded. Then the sonar returned something moving. Not a fish school. Not a seal cluster. Not even a whale signature. The mass was too large and too diffuse at once. Like the edge of it wouldn't settle into one boundary before another part slid beyond the beam. It occupied a whole corridor between chambers, then vanished, then reappeared farther along in a way that made no ordinary sense of transit. At the same moment the radio crackled. Mayday, mayday, vessel disabled beyond Gull Point. Taking drift. Request immediate assistance. Nolan swore under his breath and reached for the microphone. I grabbed his wrist. The skin under my palm was cold. Listen first. He yanked free. The next line came over the speaker. Marker buoy gone. Ledge ahead. Nolan Pierce Greeley, answer now. It was his own voice. Not exactly. Not close enough to fool the ear in a casual room. But close enough that every hair on my arms rose. Nolan went still. The launch engine idled under us. From somewhere below the hull came that long hollow wail-like sound. Louder than I had ever heard it. Close enough now that the deck plates trembled. That isn't possible, Nolan said. No, I said. It isn't normal. He stared at the microphone. Then at the sonar. Then at the black line of Gull Point ahead. That was the moment he could still have turned back with me. Instead he said, with the brittle anger of a man defending the last intact wall in his mind. Someone is spoofing comms. Someone is down there messing with equipment. We answer distress traffic. That's what we do. He pushed the throttle forward. The launch surged toward Gull Point. The sonar image widened, not because we had changed settings, but because the chamber ahead opened like a mouth. I wish metaphor were all it had been. The old logs had not been speaking poetically when they wrote about territory. The thing below the coast was not a monster in the childish sense. It was an organism built around place. Everything in the records pointed to that once I stopped asking the wrong question. It did not wander the sea. It inhabited a system. Caverns, fissures, tide gates, pressure channels, flooded vaults under ledge. It moved through them when depth, current, and moon pull aligned. When it did, the coastline above ceased behaving like stable reference. Sound bent. Radio repeated. Distance doubled. Harbors overlaid themselves. What we called anomalies were the signatures of a body too large and too buried to show itself all at once. I turned us back only because Nolan could no longer help me. He vanished at the mouth of Gull Point during the largest king tide in years. That sentence sounds cleaner than the event itself felt. There was nothing clean about it. The day began with every warning active at once. Kelp stench before sunrise. Seals gone from the shoals. Pressure in my ears building in dull waves until my teeth hurt. Sonar blanking and returning as if the bay were inhaling around the instruments. Kira Lynn Babcock closed the harbor before dawn under the unofficial rules, and I backed her without argument. No incoming traffic. No lights after midnight. No response beyond Gull Point. No duplicate contacts logged. By noon the water had climbed high enough that the old stone at the harbor mouth disappeared under a slick dark swell. Kira and I moved through the docks, shutting down anything bright or reflective we could reach. We left only low shielded guide lights pointed inward. Nothing that projected a confident shoreline out to sea. The air tasted metallic. Every sound seemed to come from a little too far away. Nolan Pierce Greeley arrived furious. He had filed complaints after the survey. He had requested outside review. He had not yet gotten it because the weather window was narrow and because, I suspect now, parts of the record that should have escalated never reached the right desks. Kira had been deleting more than duplicate vessel tracks. She had been pruning the paper trail that would have brought federal procedure straight into the creature's feeding range. He came to the office with formal language ready and stopped speaking halfway through his first demand because the radar screen lit with 6 identical vessel contacts entering on the same route. Not 6 vessels. 1, repeated 6 times. The room smelled so strongly of exposed weed that my eyes watered. Log them, Nolan said, but his voice had changed. It had lost certainty and become automatic, a reflex repeating its training while the rest of him watched it fail. Kira switched off the radar archive feed. No! Then the fog formed. It poured upward from the harbor mouth in thick gray folds, denser than weather, carrying that low wail note in layers, as if a whole sound had been shredded into strips and drawn through the piers. My ears slammed shut with pressure. When they cleared, I heard radios chattering on channels no one in the room had opened. Distress calls. Old ones. Decades of them. Different voices stepping on each other. Same wording. Same coordinates. Through the front window the harbor was gone. The other one had come in full. Docks in impossible positions. Buildings leaning where cliff should have been. Water occupying space the town itself used by day. Vessels at slips outside any registry. And behind all of it, not hidden anymore, the true shape of Gull Point opening like a vast flooded gate in the rock. Something moved there. Not breach. Not surface. Move. The best.